things like polarity thinking, polarity intelligence, this is not a luxury anymore. This is a necessity. This is a requirement for our era today. We live in an era of polarization, right? And that polarization, what that really means is we're seeing the worst version of X and the worst version of Y being presented as an either or. It's a false choice. We're being presented with false choices every day, particularly in the political world. There's a number of things coming down in the days and weeks to come, and I just want to give people sort of a sneak peek at what's going on. The first one actually just released last week, and I'm just going to share my screen really quickly here. So this is the first installment in a larger integral operating system starter kit, which is basically a series of free primers, explainers for these concepts. I just released the very first one last week, and it's on polarity. It's called Two Sides of Every Truth, and it starts off with this really nice visualization of polarities, and you get this nice visualization of, to me, what it kind of looks like to go from either or thinking to both and thinking, right?
And look at the infinity sign.
Yep, and look at that loop. And you notice what it's doing is, because in the polarity map, the top represents the healthy expression of a pole. The bottom represents the negative expression of a pole when that pole gets dissociated from its counterpole. So you constantly have this oscillation, right, where we're experiencing sort of the positives of one pole, and then we overemphasize, and that brings us to the negative, and then we self-correct by going to the positives of the counterpole. Tend to overemphasize, that brings its negatives, and then around and around we go. This is a really, really wonderful resource, I think, for people who are just learning about polarity intelligence. And I encourage all of our members who already know the basics of this stuff to share this. Share this free primer with friends and family and your social networks, with anyone who you think will benefit from this. And again, this is just sort of the pre-primer. This is just a few visualizations to kind of, grab your attention. And then you get into the actual primer itself. It's very short. It'll take you about 30 minutes or so to get through. But, it really, really came together nicely. Like, one of my favorite pages is "The Culture Wars Are Polarity Wars." And here you can see sort of examples of some of the polarities that are always working underneath the surface and animating so many of the culture war arguments and battles and debates. In fact, I'm drawing upon many of these polarities, as well as a number of others, in the new debate analyzer platform that I built on Integral Life. So you'll see sort of this polarity intelligence more and more in all the various content releases that we're doing and so forth. So this is one resource, the first resource. Again, this is 100% free for people. They just need to basically give us their email address in exchange for the free web course. The other thing that I've been working on for a while that I'm really excited to release very soon, probably around the time that this episode gets published on Integral Life, is this AI tool, the Polarity Engine. Okay? And the way this works is you can enter any polarity. If you don't have a polarity in mind, that's okay. You can type in something like politics, and it'll give you 3 suggested polarities to look at that are often associated with something like politics. But here I've got one all queued up so we can take a look at what this thing actually does. So the Polarity Engine, I entered one of my favorite polarities because I think it's so incredibly important in this era of Dunning-Kruger, right? This era of being so overconfident about what we know and completely blind to how much of reality we have not yet learned about, right? That makes us, sort of confidently arrogant in a lot of ways, and an unearned arrogance. So the confidence-humility polarity this is always like my leading example of a polarity to explore. So let's just look at what this AI app generates. So you enter confidence and humility. First, it gives you this overview, right? And we go down. Here's more overviews describing why it matters, how it shows up in daily life. Here's the description of the 2 poles. Here's the full polarity map with the positives and the negatives of each pole. And then it keeps going. So we're going to go down. Here's some real world examples. Here's the shadow dynamics, what happens when these poles become completely dissociated from each other. the kinds of shadow realms and shadow patterns and loops that we can find ourselves in. This gives us a way to identify those patterns and loops and, again, self-correct. How to recognize some context signals, some tips on working with the polarity. So if you're over-indexing confidence, here's a set of practices. If you're over-indexing humility, like this is often a problem of mine, I suffer from imposter syndrome and things like that, it's an invitation to realign the polarity. This, I think, is pretty innovative, Keith. This is a developmental context, because what I started to notice is that it's one thing to talk about polarities, but oftentimes you see the different poles of a polarity being expressed or argued from different stages of development, right? The classic example I often use is freedom and responsibility. Someone might be arguing freedom from a purely red stage, nobody tells me what the fuck to do, right? And then responsibility is being argued from a green pluralistic stage, let's say, right? Well, you're still kind of talking across each other because you're both enacting your respective poles in sort of different, developmental ways. This is an invitation to remember to look beneath the developmental expression and find the true but partial aspect of each of these poles that you really don't want to throw out with the bathwater. So even though someone is arguing freedom from a red stage, and that might strike you as kind of obnoxious or just contextually inappropriate or whatever it might be, it's a reminder that, like, well, that doesn't mean we want to dismiss freedom altogether. Of course not, right? Of course we don't want to. So it just gives you a way of recognizing the different ways that people talk about and enact these poles and these polarities. Some integration challenges, integrated polarity, what they look like, and then some tips to integrate. So that is the new AI engine, the Polarity engine that I've created. This is available to all Integral Life core members. If you are a core member right now, you will have access to this next week. Okay? And then the final thing, let me stop this screen share, that is very exciting, is for those who don't know her, our very good friend Nomali Pereira was on with us last month talking about the Enneagram. She is going to be doing a live 5-month-long course on polarities called Polarity Lab. We will be making that announcement very, very soon. This is for anyone and everyone who wants to, go deep into this work. And Nomali, as many of you found out a month ago, is just a fantastic teacher. And she's been doing, working with polarities for, I think, longer than I have. And she's brilliant. She's brilliant with this material. So that is going to be made available. The actual course is going to begin on, I believe, July 11th. So a week after the 4th. It's going to be every other week. Integral Life members all get an automatic 20% discount to this course. So keep your eye out and stay tuned for when we make the full course announcement. This is basically, Keith, all of this is to say, this is the summer of polarities. And that's why I wanted to do this episode with you to look at polarities in the context of psychotherapy. Because I know that this is something that we've alluded to several times in past programs, but we've never actually devoted an entire episode to it. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you as, a clinician. How do these polarities actually show up in your work with individuals, with families, with couples, etc.? I think this is one of the most critical thing about polarities is the scalability of this methodology.
Right, anything.
Right? Because you can go from personal to professional to political, right? This is the other thing. This is sort of my framing here, Keith, is that things like polarity thinking, polarity intelligence, this is not a luxury anymore. This is a necessity. This is a requirement for our era today. We live in an era of polarization, right? And that polarization, what that really means is we're seeing the worst version of X and the worst version of Y being presented as an either or. It's a false choice. We're being presented with false choices every day, particularly in the political world.
Well, wait,
right?
And one thing about this, our nervous system is primed to be attracted to the worst of one side.
Yeah, we have a negativity bias. We have, there's a number of reasons.
And so if you're not aware of the polarity of I prefer the good, but I'm attracted to the bad,
Right.
I prefer the beautiful, but I'm attracted to the ugly.
Right.
If you're not managing that polarity in yourself, you can be colonized.
That's right. And you can, and what you'll do is you'll
colonized. So many people are colonized because they don't manage that polarity in themselves.
That's right. So you're projecting your own unintegration onto the world at large. And that's often how we see. So again, this is literally the reason that I created the debate analyzer. This is the whole reason. The first thing, when people, I'm going to share a screen again. So when people look at these debate analyses, right? Here's one, for example. This was a debate about Christian nationalism. Between Kyla Turner, who is one of my absolute favorite debaters. She is just fantastic, and I think is sort of naturally integral in a lot of ways, even though I don't think she's ever heard of this framework. She's a wonderful debater. That's her on the left. Versus Sarah Stock. Sarah Stock was for a while a fairly famous kind of trad wife, kind of deeply conservative, very amber kind of Christian nationalist. So in this debate, the typical response is like, oh, geez, Christian nationalism, obviously we want to throw that in the garbage. We demand world-centric governing structures and so forth. But what the nice thing about the debate analyzer says, okay, whoa, fair enough, but everyone has a true but partial sort of version of reality, right? And we want to honor what's true, and we want to sort of contain what is partial. So that is what the debate analyzer is literally built to do. So the first thing people are going to notice when they look at this are the numbers. Those are developmental numbers using Terry O'Fallon's system. That's a developmental vertical piece, right? So it's saying Kyla is mostly coming from a basically orange developmental stage. Sarah is mostly coming from that umber, that sort of the stage between amber and orange, what Torbert calls expert, or what Suzanne Cook-Reuter calls skill-centric, right? She's mostly coming from that stage. So we're seeing a stage mismatch, and we're also seeing that in how they are sort of inhabiting their side of their preferred polarities. But what I hope the debate analyzer is making very, very clear is that these developmental assessments, it's only the first part of the story. By far, the most interesting part of the story is looking at the actual polarities underneath their argument. Because it's my belief that in this polarized world, this politically polarized world that we live in, whenever we see these debates, whenever we see these arguments and these conflicts, these either-or conflicts, just beneath the surface is a polarity that is dying for a new integration. Right? And until we find a way to integrate that polarity on a civilizational scale, right, then these arguments are going to continue popping themselves up. If you're tired of Christian nationalism, then you need to integrate the polarities that are driving things like Christian nationalism in the first place. So the polarities... Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, this is great, beautiful, interesting.
Before you comment, I just want to point to these actual polarities keys. So there's a polarity, for example, between sacrificial love and ordered love. We kind of want to, and that's a classic Christian polarity that has been being theologically debated for centuries, right? And it's still alive with us today because we have failed to integrate that polarity. There's a polarity between universal care and particular care. There's a polarity between our international responsibility and our national self-interest. Now, granted, Sarah is arguing national self-interest from a somewhat earlier stage than Kyla is. And that's going to make many integralists say, well, I want to side with Kyla because she's developmentally more sophisticated. However, if you disregard all of the poles that Sarah is trying to represent and is trying to argue in this debate, then you are missing something. Not only are you missing something really important, but you are guaranteeing that this argument is going to perpetuate for years, decades, possibly centuries.
Absolutely.